Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The Game Warden. I've been a game warden for the state of Maine for going on 19 years. Before I tell you what I've seen out there, I want you to understand what that job actually means in a place like this state, because most people picture it as writing tickets to guys who fish without a license, and that's about as far from the reality as you can get. Maine is the most forested state east of the Mississippi. Close to 90% of it is covered by trees. We have 17 million acres of commercial timberland in what we call the unorganized territories in the northern part of the state. Land with no town government, no municipal services, no zoning, no streetlights, no year-round residents in most of it. Some of that country, if you drove it in winter, you could go for 4 or 5 hours without seeing another vehicle. I've been to active poaching scenes that took me 2 hours on forest roads to reach. I've responded to hunting accidents and drainages that barely exist on any map I could find. I've spent nights in my truck in places where the nearest building was 15 miles in any direction, with nothing between me and whatever was out there except a vehicle door and a sidearm. I've seen black bear up close more times than I could count. I've seen moose that dwarfed my truck. I've seen what weather does to a human body when it's been out in a Maine winter for 3 or 4 days, which is something I'll carry for the rest of my life and never need to go into detail about here. In 19 years, I've developed a very clear, very precise picture of what this state's wilderness looks like, sounds like, and feels like in every season, at every hour, in every kind of weather. I say all of that because what I'm about to tell you happened to a person who cannot be written off as someone who startles easily or sees things in the dark. What I've experienced out in those woods is something I can no longer explain away, and I've spent years trying. I'm going to tell you about several things, in the order they happened, because the order matters. Each one on its own might be something a careful, skeptical person could explain away. By the time I get to the last one, I think you'll understand why I can't sleep the way I used to, why I transferred out of the Northern District after 18 years of requesting to stay there, and why there's a particular stretch of logging road north of Greenville that I will not drive alone after dark, regardless of what a call requires. The first thing happened in my 3rd year on the job. I was still learning the Northern Territory, still building the mental map of roads and drainages and camp locations that takes years to fully develop. It was late October, a clear cold night, temperature in the 20s, full moon that turned the snow on the open ground almost bright enough to read by. I was running a patrol loop in the western part of my district, checking for road hunting violations on a network of logging roads that see illegal spotlighting every fall without fail. No radio traffic, quiet shift, the kind of night where the cold keeps everything still and the woods have a particular clarified quality that I've always liked, the way everything sounds sharper when the temperature drops. Around midnight, I came down a gradual hill on a stretch of road I'd driven probably 50 times and saw something standing at the edge of the road, maybe 200 feet ahead. My first red, immediate and automatic, was a person, tall, upright, 2 legs, standing still at the road's edge. My first thought was a hunter who'd driven in to spotlight deer and was standing outside his truck for some reason. The truck maybe pulled off somewhere I couldn't see it in the dark ahead. I slowed and got my hand on the spotlight mounted to my door frame. When the spotlight hit it, it turned and looked at me. I've described that moment to exactly 2 people in 19 years, both of them fellow wardens I trust completely, and I've used the same words both times. It was the wrong shape. The body was wrong. The limbs were wrong. The way it was standing was wrong. Too much height, too little width. The way the shoulder line connected to the neck was wrong in a way that I can't be more precise about, except that it registered in my gut as profoundly not right before any conscious analysis caught up to that reading. And the eyes. When the spotlight hit its eyes, they reflected back in a way that was not how human eyes reflect and not how deer eyes reflect. I've seen thousands of deer eyes in a spotlight over 19 years, and I've seen human eyes caught in my spotlight at close range more times than I'd like. This was neither. It looked at me for maybe 3 seconds. Then it stepped backward off the road into the trees, not running, not bolting the way a spooked deer bolts, just stepping off the road with a single, deliberate movement and disappearing. The trees closed up behind it, and it was gone. I sat in my truck for probably 2 minutes before I got out. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't shaken, because I was. But I was also a game warden on duty with a job to do, and if a person had been standing on that road, and my rational brain was offering that explanation, fighting hard for it, then I had a responsibility to at least check. I got my flashlight and walked to where it had been standing. No tracks. The road verge was soft enough, frost-softened dirt with a thin layer of wet snow on it, to have held a print. There were no prints. I swept the flashlight along the tree line for several yards in both directions. Nothing. I went back to my truck, wrote a brief, factual note in my patrol log. Tall figure observed at road edge, stood briefly in spotlight, departed into timber, no identification made, and finished my shift. I didn't tell anyone for close to 6 months. When I finally mentioned it to my district supervisor, a 25-year veteran who'd worked northern Maine his entire career, he listened without interrupting and then asked what the eye reflection color had been. When I told him, he nodded once, slowly, said he'd heard similar accounts from 3 other wardens over his career, and then changed the subject. He changed it so deliberately and so finally that I understood the conversation was over, and I didn't push. That was the first thing. I want you to keep it in mind as I describe what came later, because in isolation it's a strange night, and a strange sighting, and no more than that. And I might have eventually made my peace with it the way you make your peace with things that don't have an explanation. I know now that I wouldn't have gotten that peace, because it wasn't finished with me. The second thing happened 14 months later. Different part of my district, a drainage in the northeastern corner that I covered primarily during hunting season for illegal deer activity, a remote stretch where I rarely went in the off-season because there was rarely a call for it. This was early June. I'd gotten a report of someone camping illegally in a designated no-camping zone, leaving garbage, possibly running an unlicensed camp that was attracting bears to the garbage and creating a safety issue. Not an unusual complaint, not an urgent one, the kind of low-priority follow-up I'd get to when the workload allowed. The access road to that drainage was about 12 miles of old logging grade, mostly passable in summer with my truck, but rough enough that I almost never saw other vehicles on it. I drove it in the mid-afternoon, figured I'd check the reported site, document whatever I found, and be back on the main road before dark. That was my plan. I found the camp. It was empty, had clearly been abandoned recently, left in the state that irresponsible campers sometimes leave, fire ring, scattered food waste, a single camp chair left behind, the kind of mess that takes an hour of wildlife service time to properly remediate. I photographed it for my report, noted the coordinates, and started back down the logging grade toward the main road. About 3 miles down the road from the camp, my truck's engine quit. Just quit, no warning, no sputtering, running fine 1 second, dead the next. I coasted to a stop. I tried to restart it. Nothing. Not a click, not a crank attempt, nothing. My radio and my phone both worked, which meant it wasn't an electrical failure of that magnitude. But I was 12 miles from the main road on a logging grade in a drainage that I had never, in 3 years of patrolling it, seen another vehicle on. I called dispatch, reported my situation, requested a tow be sent, and was told the nearest available unit was close to 3 hours out and that it would be full dark by the time they reached me. 3 hours alone on a logging road in a remote drainage in northern Maine in early June is not, on its own, a frightening thing. I'd been in worse situations. I had supplies, I had my sidearm, I had a working radio. I settled in to wait. About an hour in, when the light was going gold and starting to drop, I heard something in the woods to my left, in the tree line, maybe 50 yards off the road. Not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to hear with some precision. It was heavy, moving slowly, and it was paralleling the road, moving in the same direction I'd been driving, north to south. This, on its own, was not alarming. Moose parallel roads all the time. So do bears. Whatever it was, I kept an eye on the tree line and waited for it to show itself or move off. It didn't show itself, but it also didn't move off. It stayed at roughly that 50-yard distance, paralleling the road at a slow, steady pace, and after about 5 minutes I started to track it by sound, the occasional crack of a branch, the rustle of movement through undergrowth, the periodic heavier sound of something shifting its weight on damp ground. It was moving the way something moves when it's watching something else rather than going somewhere specific. Methodical, attentive. Then it stopped, and the woods went quiet in a way that had a specific quality to it, a pressure drop quality that I don't know how else to describe, as though something had changed in the atmosphere without any change in the actual weather. I got out of my truck. I know that sounds like exactly the wrong decision, and looking back, I'm not sure it wasn't. But I'm a game warden. I enforce the law in places like this. Staying in a broken-down truck while something I can't identify circles it at dusk is not how I'm built to respond to a situation. I got out with my flashlight and my sidearm, and I walked to the tree line. The trees were dense enough at the road's edge that my flashlight only penetrated about 20 feet of good visibility before the dark swallowed it. I stood at that edge for close to 2 minutes, listening. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no small animal movement, nothing. That complete silence in a drainage that had been actively producing bird and insect sound all afternoon was its own kind of alarm, and I was processing it consciously enough that I noticed it even in the middle of everything else. Then, from somewhere in the trees ahead and slightly to my right, I heard something that I had never heard in 3 years of working in that country, and that I have never heard since, and that I have spent 19 years trying to find a credible natural explanation for. It was a sound between a human vocalization and something that no human throat should be able to produce, a sustained, descending tone that started at roughly normal human speaking pitch and fell well below it over the course of maybe 4 seconds, ending in a register that vibrated in my chest the way a subwoofer vibrates. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a growl. It was something else, something that had the shape of language without any of the content of it, a sound that was deliberate in the way only sounds made by intelligence are deliberate, with a pacing and a tonal structure that was clearly communicative even though it communicated nothing I could decode. I stood at that tree line for a long time. I don't know exactly how long. I'm not proud of this, but I was genuinely frightened in a way I don't think I'd been before as an adult. A cold, physical fear that had nothing to do with any decision I was making and everything to do with some part of my nervous system that was older and faster than any decision. The sound did not repeat. The woods remained silent. I went back to my truck, locked the door, and sat there in the dark for the 2 hours until the tow arrived. I didn't get out again. I wrote nothing in my log about it. I drove home in the tow truck and didn't sleep. I told the second warden about this one, my partner on several shifts that season, a man named Dale who'd worked northern Maine for 11 years. I described the sound as carefully as I could. He got very still while I was describing it, and when I finished he asked me exactly where on that road I'd been parked. I told him. He was quiet for a long moment, and then said he'd had a call, 2 years earlier, from a logger who'd been working a section in that same drainage, who'd refused to go back to work the following morning and had driven off the job site citing something he'd heard in the timber at dusk that he wouldn't describe in detail. Dale had written it up as a bear encounter, the standard catch-all for unexplained wildlife disturbance in his jurisdiction. He looked at me when he finished telling me that, and neither of us said anything else about it that day. 2 incidents, separated by 14 months. In different parts of a very large territory, both involving something that had no reasonable explanation. I had worked in places like this long enough to know that reasonable explanations exist for most things, that the woods produce sounds and shapes and encounters that read as sinister and turn out to be mundane, and I had no intention of becoming one of those wardens who spooked at nothing and told campfire stories. I kept doing my job. I kept patrolling my territory. I kept my notes clean and my reports factual. The third thing was different from the first 2 in ways I've thought about carefully, because the first 2 were, in their own ways, ambiguous. Strange, yes. Unexplained, yes. But ambiguous in the sense that a careful skeptic could still construct an explanation around them, even if those explanations required a lot of cooperative coincidence and more than a little willing blindness. The third thing was not ambiguous. The third thing was the one that broke something in how I understand the world I work in, and I think it will break something in how you understand it too, if you've been patient enough to follow me this far. This was my 12th year on the job. September. Early rifle season. I was running a patrol circuit in the north-central part of my district, a section that includes a network of old logging roads and several registered hunting camps, the kind of area that gets heavy traffic in September and October from out-of-state hunters, which means my workload doubles and the call frequency is high, and I'm spending a lot of time driving roads I know extremely well in conditions that range from early morning darkness to late evening darkness, because that's when the violations happen. I'd had a long day. 3 license checks, a loaded weapon and vehicle violation that required a lengthy roadside stop and some paperwork, and a call about an unreported deer kill that turned out to be legitimate with some documentation issues I helped the hunters resolve. By 8 in the evening I was tired, which I mention not to excuse anything, but because it's honest, and because I want you to have the full picture. I was tired. I was also sober, rested enough, and completely familiar with the road I was driving. The road is a main logging grade that runs roughly north-south for about 22 miles before connecting to a paved state road at either end. I've driven it close to 1,000 times over my career. Every bend, every washboard stretch, every seasonal pond visible from the road, every section where the timber is dense on both sides versus where a clear cut opens the view. I know that road the way I know my own house. At mile marker 14, heading south, there is a section where a side road branches off to the east, leading to a cluster of registered hunting camps about 3 miles in. There's a pullout at that junction, a wide spot in the road where the logging company trucks used to stage, now used by hunters as a parking area for camp access on foot or ATV. I've stopped at that pullout hundreds of times. That night, as I came around the bend approaching the junction, my headlights lit up the pullout, and there were 3 vehicles parked in it that I didn't recognize as registered to any of the camps I knew in that drainage. This was not unusual. Hunters sometimes park at junctions and hike into unmarked spots, but it was late enough in the evening that I decided to stop and check. Hunters parked at a road junction at 8 at night in rifle season, in a part of the state where I'd had ongoing poaching activity, was worth a 10-minute stop. I parked behind the vehicles and ran the plates. 2 came back clean, registered to addresses in Massachusetts. The 3rd came back to a camp owner further north in my district, which was unusual. His registered camp was about 30 miles north of this junction, and there was no obvious reason for his truck to be parked here. I noted it as a discrepancy worth following up on and decided to do a quick walk of the immediate area to see if there was any obvious activity I should know about before I moved on. I got out of my truck with my flashlight. The night was overcast, no moon, temperature about 40 degrees, light wind from the north. The hunting camp road to the east was gated with a county gate that was standing open, the chain loose on the post. This was normal. Camp owners had keys and commonly left it open during hunting season for ATV access. I walked about 100 yards up the camp road, just far enough to get a sense of whether anyone was currently coming or going, and found nothing. I was turning back toward my truck when I heard the sound. Not the sound from the drainage the year before, something different, and in some ways worse. What I heard was a child's voice. A child, somewhere in the timber to my left, maybe 50 to 60 yards off the camp road, calling out. Not calling for help, not crying. Calling, the way a child calls out in a game, the particular high, almost sing-song tone of a child who is playing and calling to another player. Hello. And then a pause. And then, with the kind of patience that didn't fit a child at play, hello, again. I stopped walking. I am a law enforcement officer. I am trained in wilderness search and rescue. And I have a child's voice calling from an unlit stretch of timber at 8 at night in September in a part of Maine where the nearest house was close to 15 miles away. My response to that, professionally and as a human being, was immediate and complete. I turned toward the sound and called back, identifying myself as a game warden, telling whoever it was to keep making noise so I could locate them. The voice stopped. I kept calling as I moved toward where it had come from, sweeping my flashlight through the trees, covering ground carefully. I went about 40 yards into the timber before I had to slow down. The undergrowth was dense enough that moving faster would have been both loud and potentially injurious in the dark. I kept calling. No response. I spent close to 20 minutes in those woods, grid-searching a rough area centered on where I'd heard the voice originate, before I accepted that I was not going to find anyone by continuing in that direction. I went back to my truck, called dispatch, reported what I'd heard, and requested confirmation that no one had reported a missing child in my district or the adjacent districts. Dispatch came back within 10 minutes. No reports. No missing persons, no lost hikers, no unaccounted for children anywhere in the relevant radius. I went back into those woods with a better light. I spent another 40 minutes in there. I found nothing. No child, no boot prints in the soft duff that the September rains had made receptive to impressions, no evidence of recent human passage in any direction that would have indicated someone moving through that section of timber. If a child had been standing 50 yards into those trees calling out, they had crossed 40 yards of soft forest floor to get there, and they had left no mark on it. I drove the camp road all the way to the registered camps, about 3 miles in. All the camps were dark, no vehicles, no signs of recent occupation. I drove back to the junction, checked the 3 vehicles, still there, no change. I sat at that pullout for close to an hour, keeping the radio open, watching and listening. Nothing. I'll tell you what I think now, which is different from what I was willing to think then. I think the voice I heard was not a child. I think it was a thing that could produce a sound in the approximate range of a child's voice, and that had learned, or understood, that producing that specific sound in that specific context would cause a trained law enforcement officer to leave his vehicle, enter an unlit section of timber at night, and attempt to move toward the source. I think it was hunting me the way I have spent 19 years watching things hunt in those woods, with patience and with method, and with an understanding of how its target behaves under specific triggers. I don't know what it was. I know what it was doing. I finished my shift. I went home. I didn't tell anyone what I'd heard for close to 2 years. Not because I was afraid of being disbelieved. By that point in my career, I had enough credibility that I wasn't particularly worried about it, but because naming it out loud made it more real than I was ready for it to be, and I was still hoping, in a quiet, increasingly desperate way, that time would produce a better explanation than the one I'd arrived at sitting in that pullout in the dark. 2 years is a long time to carry something like that, and the weight of it changes how you work. I won't pretend otherwise. I became more careful at night, more deliberate about my vehicle positioning, more attentive to the specific quality of sound that preceded the things I'd experienced. Not paranoid. I kept doing my job, kept going into the field alone at night, kept handling whatever the work required. But changed. You do this work long enough, and you develop an instinct for the difference between ordinary wilderness and wilderness that has something in it that has noticed you. I was paying closer attention to that instinct than I ever had before. The fourth incident was the one that involved another person, which is the reason I'm able to tell this story at all, because without corroboration, without another trained observer standing next to me when it happened, I think I might have found a way to talk myself out of what I know I saw. When you're alone, you can always find the crack in your own certainty and work at it long enough to open it up. When there's someone standing next to you who saw exactly what you saw, that escape route is closed. My partner that night was a warden named Catherine, 12 years on the job, for years in my district before being reassigned north. She was riding with me on a specific enforcement detail, joint patrol during the first week of deer season, when our district supervisor liked to put 2 wardens on the same truck to maximize coverage efficiency. We'd worked together dozens of times over her 4 years, and I considered her as good a field officer as anyone I'd served with. She was not someone who startled. She had worked a fatal hunting accident scene with me 2 years earlier and handled it with more composure than I had. We were driving the Maine logging grade, the same road I've already described, heading north, around 10:30 at night. The date was October 19th. I can tell you that with certainty because I checked the patrol log within 24 hours of what happened and confirmed the date, and because I have been unable to forget it since. At mile marker 9, heading north, 5 miles before the junction where I'd heard the voice 2 years earlier, something came out of the woods on the right side of the road and stood in the road directly in front of my truck. I hit the brakes. My reflexive speed reaction was that it was a moose, which come out of the trees fast and large and will kill you in a vehicle collision without much effort, and I had the truck stopped with some distance to spare before my headlights resolved what was actually in the road. It was standing on 2 legs. It was close to 8 feet tall. It was not a moose, and it was not a person, and it was not a bear, and it was not any animal I have ever seen in 19 years of working in the wildlife of this state or anywhere else. It was dark in coloring, dark brown or black. I couldn't be precise in my headlights, but it had a texture to it that was not fur in any sense I understood, more like something dried or layered, the way dead vegetation looks when it's compressed and dried, a matted quality that didn't reflect light cleanly the way healthy fur does. The body was wrong in the same way I'd noted years earlier, too long in the torso relative to the leg length, arms that hung lower than they should have, a shoulder structure that suggested something different from any shoulder I had a reference point for. Its face, if I can use that word, was what I'm going to struggle most to describe. I had about 8 to 10 seconds of clear headlight illumination before it moved, and I spent those seconds looking at it in the way that trained observers look at things they need to be able to describe later, actively taking inventory rather than simply experiencing the moment. The face had features in roughly the configuration you'd expect: 2 eyes, something that could be interpreted as a nose, something that could be interpreted as a mouth. But the proportions were wrong, the eyes too far apart and too large, the mouth too wide, and the expression, if it was making an expression, was not one I recognized as belonging to any emotional or physical state that I have a name for. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't neutral. It was something else, something that had no correspondence in any facial expression I'd seen on any living thing. It looked at us. I know it was looking at us because its head turned, slowly and deliberately, from facing roughly northeast, whatever direction it had been facing when it emerged from the trees, to facing directly at the truck, and when it completed that turn and its eyes were directed at our windshield, I felt something that I can only describe as being looked at by something that understood exactly what it was looking at. That sounds abstract, and I know it sounds abstract, but I don't have a better description. There was intelligence in that look, a specific, unmistakable quality of active assessment that no animal in my experience produces, and that only a limited range of humans produce, the quality of a mind taking information and doing something immediate and purposeful with it. Catherine said, very quietly, without moving anything but her mouth, "Are you seeing this?" It was not a question. It was a confirmation request, the specific, low, controlled speech of a trained officer making sure their partner has the same situational awareness without doing anything that would change the situation. I said yes. The thing in the road took one step, not toward us. To the side, its left, toward the far edge of the road. That step produced no sound that I could hear over my running engine, which I noted at the time and have noted many times since. A thing close to 8 feet tall, moving on this road surface, producing no audible footfall. One step, and then it simply stepped off the road into the timber on the far side, and was not visible anymore. I kept the truck stopped for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I turned to Catherine. She was looking straight ahead at where it had been standing, her hands flat on her thighs, which is the posture she had when she was processing something carefully. She turned to me. Her face was completely controlled, the professional face, but her color was off. She said, "I'm going to need a minute before I figure out how we write this up." I said I understood. We sat at that spot on the road for close to 10 minutes without either of us speaking. Then Catherine, who I should say again was the most composed field officer I ever worked with, said one more thing. She said, "I've had a report like this, from my old district. A trapper. He described what he saw, and I wrote it up as a bear encounter because I didn't have a better category. I owe that man an apology." We drove to the point where it had crossed, and I got out with my flashlight and checked the road surface and the verge on both sides. There was nothing on the road surface. On the verge, where the timber met the road's edge, I found a single impression in soft ground that was larger than any track I had reference for, and that did not match the track pattern of any animal native to this state. I photographed it with my phone. I have that photograph still. We reported the incident to our supervisor the following morning. We wrote our individual accounts separately and without comparing notes, and then read each other's accounts in the supervisor's office. They were the same account: the height, the coloring, the texture, the face, the step, and the departure. Same account, written by two separate people, neither of whom had discussed specifics with the other before writing. Our supervisor read both reports. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was going to keep both reports in his personal files rather than submitting them through the normal chain, and that this was his call to make as district supervisor, and that he was making it, and that neither of us should feel that the decision reflected on our credibility or our service. He said it had the specific tone of a person announcing a decision rather than opening a discussion, and neither of us argued. That was 11 years into my career. I had 8 more years in that district before I transferred. In those 8 years, I had 3 more incidents that I would classify as belonging to the same general category as what I've already described, none of them as sustained or as clearly observed as the night with Catherine, but each of them consistent with the same essential profile: something large, upright, bipedal, wrong in its proportions and in the quality of its attention, in the remote northern interior of this state, in places where people rarely went and almost never went alone at night. I'm going to describe the remaining 3 incidents briefly, because the detail I want to give you now is not the catalog of sightings, but something else, something I've been working towards since I started this account. The 5th incident, my 14th year, was a sound, not a sighting. I was on a snowmobile doing a winter patrol through a section of frozen lake and river terrain, checking for illegal ice fishing on waters that were closed for that season. Late afternoon, maybe 4 o'clock, the light already going blue at the edges. I stopped my snowmobile to check a drill hole in the ice that suggested recent illegal fishing activity. In the silence after the engine cut out, I heard, from the far shore of the lake, maybe 3/4 of a mile away, the same descending vocalization I'd heard years earlier in the drainage where my truck had broken down. The same tonal structure, the same impossible register drop at the end of it. At 3/4 of a mile across open frozen water, the sound carried with a clarity that let me be as certain of it as I've been of anything I've heard in the field. I looked across the lake at the far shore for a long time. I didn't see anything. I restarted my snowmobile and completed my circuit and did not stop at the far shore. I want to be honest with you about that. I didn't stop at the far shore. The 6th incident, my 16th year, was a smell. I know that sounds like the least dramatic possible sensory experience, but I want you to understand that smell in a specific wilderness context carries information the same way sound and sight do, and that what I smelled on a section of logging road in late August of my 16th year was something I had no reference point for. It was sudden, strong, and completely out of any context I could supply for it. A heavy, organic, wrong smell that arrived and was gone within less than a minute, that I could not attribute to any animal, any vegetation, any decomposition in any stage that I had ever smelled in field conditions. The nearest comparison I can offer, and it's imprecise, is the smell of something very large and very animal that has been wet for a long time, but layered with something underneath that had a chemical quality, something almost electrical. It lasted less than a minute. It was accompanied by a brief, complete cessation of bird noise in the surrounding timber, and it was gone before I could do anything more than note it and roll up my window. The 7th incident, my 18th year, the last before I requested my transfer, was the one that decided it for me. Not because it was more frightening than the 4th, though in some ways it was, but because of where it happened and what it made me understand about the scope of what I'd been experiencing for 15 years. I was at a hunting camp that I know well, checking in on a group of out-of-state hunters who'd reported hearing something large near their camp the previous night that they wanted me to look at. This was a routine welfare check, the kind of call I get a dozen times per season, usually resolving to a bear that got too comfortable around a food source. I drove to the camp, met the hunters, and walked the perimeter with them to look for the sign they'd found. What they showed me were tracks, bipedal tracks, around the camp, circling it, from the look of the pattern, coming close enough to the main camp structure that the nearest impression was within 12 feet of the cabin wall. The tracks were in soft ground and mud near a small brook that ran behind the camp, and they were the clearest impressions I had seen in 19 years of working in country where these things left impressions at all. I photographed them extensively. I measured the stride length. I checked the depth and the toe pattern and the mid-foot impression against every reference I had. I knew what they were. I've known for years what they are, in the same way you know something that you've been slowly assembling for a long time, even as you've been telling yourself you're not assembling it. I didn't tell the hunters what I knew. I told them it was likely a large bear and recommended they secure their food and garbage more thoroughly, which was the honest, best available advice I could give while staying inside the lines of what I was authorized to say in that role. I spent an hour at that camp. When I got back to my truck, I sat in it for a while. And I thought about something that I had been aware of without fully examining for several years, that the incidents I'd experienced and the incidents I'd collected from other wardens and from the public over my career were not randomly distributed across my territory. They clustered, not perfectly, not with the precision of a map you could overlay and immediately read, but with the consistency of a pattern that existed even if I couldn't fully explain its shape. Certain drainages, certain road networks, certain elevations and terrain features. The incidents clustered, and they had been clustering for the entire 19 years I'd been working in that country, and for years before that based on what I'd heard from longer-tenured colleagues, and from the informal history of the territory that lived in the memory of the people who'd worked it longest. Whatever this is, it isn't random. It isn't transient. It has been in that country for as long as anyone who knows that country can remember, and it has been there in enough numbers and with enough consistency across enough seasons and enough geography that I no longer believe what I was willing to believe in my third year on the job, which was that I'd seen something unusual once and might not see it again. I requested my transfer 6 months after that camp call. I transferred to a coastal district with smaller territory, more roads, less remote access, more populated. I did it for reasons I gave my supervisor that were professional and documented and true, better alignment with my personal life, shorter commute, wanting a change after 18 years. Those reasons were all real. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I had spent 18 years working a piece of country that I'd come to understand was not empty in the way I'd been taught wilderness was empty, and the weight of that understanding had become something I needed to put down before it did something permanent to how I functioned. I still work as a game warden. I still work alone. I still go out in the dark, on bad roads, in country that most people will never see. I carry what I know the way you carry any knowledge that doesn't have a comfortable home, in a part of your mind that you've learned to keep separate from the part that functions in ordinary daylight. On most days, that separation holds. What I want to leave you with, and I've thought about how to say this, because I want to say it accurately and not dramatically, is this. I spent 18 years working a territory in northern Maine. I know that territory better than I know almost anything. I know what lives there and what doesn't, what sounds right and what doesn't, what tracks belong and what don't, what a human being behaving strangely in the dark looks like, and what something that isn't a human being looks like in the same conditions. I have logged close to 1,000 patrol nights in those woods. Whatever is in those drainages, in those remote logging road networks, in the dark timber north of Greenville and north of Jackman and north of Millinocket, it is real. It is large. It is old. It has been there for much longer than I have. It leaves tracks when it chooses to, and doesn't when it doesn't. It vocalizes sometimes, in ways that no animal I know vocalizes. It has learned, or has always known, that a child's voice will bring a person out of a vehicle. It watches. It knows it's being watched. And it has been doing all of this in the same piece of country, in the same patterns, for years before I arrived, and for every year I worked there, and it is almost certainly doing it right now, tonight, in timber so thick and so remote that nothing I did in 18 years came close to mapping the edges of it. I don't know what it is. I've heard the names people use, and I'm not going to use them here, because names give the impression of understanding, and I don't want to give you that impression. I don't understand what it is. I understand where it is, and approximately how it behaves, and what it does when a truck with game warden markings comes down its roads at night. That knowledge, accumulated across 19 years, is the most complete picture I have, and it's incomplete in all the ways that matter. I'll tell you what I tell the few people I trust enough to have this conversation with, and that's just this. If you spend any significant amount of time alone in the deep woods in Maine at night, you are not alone. I do not mean that as metaphor. I do not mean it as folklore. I mean it as the professional assessment of a person who has spent 18 years looking very carefully at that specific question in that specific place, and who has come to a conclusion that he couldn't have reached any other way than the one he reached it. Whatever is in those woods has always been there. It was there before the logging roads were cut. It was there before the camps were built. It was there before the wardens were commissioned. It was there before the settlers, before the trappers, before whatever came before them. The woods were its territory first, and 19 years of my career were spent driving roads through it in the dark, and sometimes, on certain roads, on certain nights, it let me know it was aware of me. Not threatening. Not every time. Just aware. Just watching. Just making sure I understood that whatever I thought I was doing out there alone at night, whatever authority I thought I carried, whatever uniform I thought meant something in that timber, I was moving through something else's country by permission. And the permission wasn't mine to grant or revoke. It never was. That's what I found in 19 years of game warden work in northern Maine. That's what I needed to tell you. Sleep well. There's a section I left out of the account of that first incident that I want to come back to now, because I've spent the better part of 19 years understanding that the things I initially leave out are usually the things that matter most. What I left out is what happened when I got home that morning. I drove home around 4 in the morning after finishing my shift, came in through the garage, sat down at my kitchen table, and spent about an hour and a half trying to think myself into a corner where the spotlight incident had a mundane explanation. I'm a methodical person. I work through problems by process of elimination when I can, and I applied that to this the same way I'd apply it to any puzzle the job presented. I went through every large animal native to this state and adjacent states and eliminated them one by one. Bear, the posture was wrong, and so was the size, and so was the reflection quality. Moose, the shape was wrong, the body plan was entirely wrong. Moose in headlights at that distance and in that posture produce a completely distinctive silhouette that has nothing in common with what I'd seen. Any form of deer, too small, wrong shape, wrong behavior in a spotlight. Person, the height was wrong, the arm proportion was wrong, the behavior was wrong. Specifically this last one, a person caught in a game warden spotlight on a logging road at midnight will do something. They'll wave. They'll run. They'll call out. They'll freeze with the specific startled freeze of a person who has been caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. They will not look at you with calm deliberation and then take one slow, measured step backward into the trees as though they were concluding a meeting. By the time it was light outside, I'd exhausted every explanation the category of known animals offered me, and I'd done it honestly rather than dismissively, working through each one carefully rather than rejecting them for convenience. I hadn't dismissed anything without a reason. Every reason I found pushed me further from any explanation that didn't require something outside my existing categories. I want to be clear about what that felt like. It didn't feel like excitement. It didn't feel like the thrill of encountering something mysterious. It felt like having the floor of a room you'd been standing in your whole life turn out to be suspended over something very deep that you hadn't known was there. Once you've had that feeling, you can't unhave it. You can do a great deal of work to avoid revisiting it. You can throw yourself into the practical demands of the job. You can keep your report factual and your official position skeptical and your conversation with colleagues free of anything that would invite the kind of attention you don't want. But the feeling is there, underneath all of it, every time you drive a dark road alone at night and your headlights sweep the tree line and you catch yourself looking at it a specific way. The floor is not solid. You know it now. You just have to keep walking on it anyway because the job requires it. My district supervisor at the time was a man named Robert, 28 years on the job, the kind of veteran who'd seen most of what the Northern Territory had to offer and who spoke about the difficult parts of the work with a directness that I appreciated from my first year under him. When I finally told him about the spotlight incident, 6 months after it happened, I described it exactly as I've described it here, leaving nothing out. He listened without changing his expression or his posture, which was itself informative. A veteran officer who'd worked the same territory for almost 3 decades, hearing a story that should have prompted some reaction, producing none. He asked about the eye reflection. I told him. He nodded in a way that was not surprise. And then he asked about something else entirely, a poaching case I was working, and the conversation moved on and never went back. I thought about that a lot afterward. Not about what he knew or what he'd seen, because I didn't ask and he didn't offer. I thought about the specific quality of the nod when I described the eye reflection. It had the quality of confirmation, the nod of a person hearing something they already knew rather than something new. Which means the question about the eye reflection wasn't curiosity, it was verification. He was checking whether what I'd seen matched something he already had a description of. He retired before I could ever find a natural way to go back to that conversation, and I've thought about tracking him down many times since, and I haven't done it because I'm not sure I want to know what a person who spent 28 years working that territory confirmed in that nod. The second incident, the broken-down truck, the circling in the timber, the sound, had a coda I didn't include the first time around. The tow truck driver who came to get me, a man I knew slightly from previous calls, drove out with me in convoy and stopped about 4 miles from the junction on a section of road I knew well. He pulled over and got out of his truck, and I thought something was wrong with the tow rig, so I got out too. He was standing at the road's edge looking at the west tree line, and he had the very specific stillness of a person who has heard something and is listening for it again. I stood next to him and listened. Nothing. After maybe half a minute, he said, without looking at me, "You hear that?" I said no. He was quiet for another few seconds and then got back in his truck and we drove out. I never asked him what he thought he heard. I've regretted that many times. By the time I thought to ask, we were in town and the moment had passed, and I was still processing enough of my own night that I didn't have the presence of mind to pursue it. I never saw him again after that. I looked him up a few years later and found he'd moved out of state. What I remember most clearly about those 4 miles from the junction to where he stopped is that I was watching the tree line through my windshield the entire time, because that was the section of road that had been running parallel to whatever had been circling my truck that night, and part of me was expecting to see something in the trees. I didn't, but the tow truck driver stopped at a point I hadn't specified as significant, on a section of road I hadn't told him anything about, and heard something he mentioned only once and didn't explain. That's either meaningless coincidence or it isn't. The thing that is hardest to articulate about the child's voice incident, the third one, the one in the timber off the camp road, is what happened in the 20 minutes I spent searching for its source. Not what I didn't find, which is what I've already described. What happened to me, inside, while I was searching. I want to try to describe it accurately because I think it's important. I am trained in search operations. I've run grid searches in wilderness terrain for missing persons, including missing children, and I know the cognitive and emotional experience of that work. There's a controlled urgency to it, a managed adrenaline state, focused attention, the suppression of everything that isn't directly useful to the search. I entered those woods in that state, professional and methodical, calling out, sweeping my light, covering ground. About 5 minutes in, something changed. Not in the woods. In me. A feeling began that I had no prior experience with, something I have since described to only one other person, a fellow warden who told me he recognized what I was describing from his own experience and asked to hear the rest before saying anything more. The feeling was of being watched, but that's a crude description because being watched is a feeling most people have experienced in some mild form, and this was not mild, and it was not the garden variety prickle of someone's eyes on the back of your neck. It was total, comprehensive. It felt like the attention of whatever was in those trees was as fully on me as my attention was on the search, which would not in itself be alarming except for what that attention felt like. The closest I've come to describing it is this. It felt like being seen in a way that included understanding what you were doing, what you were looking for, and why you weren't going to find it. Not a predatory attention, something else. Something that was watching me look for it with the specific quality of focus that belongs to something that already knows how the search is going to end. I kept working. 20 minutes. Nothing found. I walked back to my truck, called dispatch, confirmed no missing persons. And I sat there and I understood, with a clarity that felt like being shown something rather than thinking something, that the voice in those trees had known exactly what it was doing. Knew that a game warden would leave his vehicle and enter an unlit section of timber in pursuit of a child in distress. Knew the trigger and applied it. Knew I was coming and stepped back from the approach vector and watched me search for something it had already removed from the equation. I don't know how it knew. I don't know where the knowledge comes from, how old it is, how many people it took to build. I know that what I experienced in those trees was not the aftermath of a random encounter. It was the aftermath of something deliberate. By the time the fourth incident happened, the night with Catherine on the logging grade at mile marker 9, I had been carrying these experiences for close to 9 years. 9 years of knowing that the territory I worked in had something in it that I couldn't file under any category my training or my profession had given me. 9 years of keeping my reports factual, keeping my conversations with colleagues careful, doing my job with the specific competence and professionalism that the job required while underneath that professional surface carrying knowledge that didn't fit anywhere I could put it. People who work in professions like mine develop a characteristic relationship with knowledge they can't act on. You see a lot, in this work, that you can't fully address, situations with no clean resolution, cases with no definitive answer, witnesses you believe and can't prove, perpetrators you know and can't catch. You develop a high tolerance for living inside ambiguity, for functioning effectively while carrying a significant amount of unresolved information. That tolerance had kept me operational through 9 years of this particular ambiguity. What the night at mile marker 9 did was change the nature of the thing I was tolerating, because for the first time it wasn't something I'd experienced alone. I want to tell you about Catherine more carefully than I have, because she matters to this account in a way that goes beyond being a corroborating witness. Catherine had 12 years on the job when we rode together that October. Before the game warden service, she'd worked 3 years as a county sheriff's deputy, doing everything that entails in a rural Maine county, which is not insignificant. She was, in my professional assessment, the most composed and accurate field observer I worked with in 19 years, and I include in that assessment some very good people. She noticed things. She remembered details. She didn't editorialize and she didn't dramatize. Her incident reports were models of clear, factual documentation, and I'd read enough of them over 4 years of working adjacent territory to know her style well. When we were sitting in the truck at mile marker 9 after it crossed the road, in the 30 seconds or so before either of us spoke, I was watching her the way a trained observer watches a colleague in a significant situation, taking inventory of her response the same way I took inventory of everything I'd seen in the road. She was controlled. Her breathing was measured. Her hands were flat on her thighs, not gripping anything, which is actually the response of a person with strong training under stress. Loose hands, managed breathing, silence until there's something useful to say. What I could see in her face, past the professional control, was a quality I've only seen a handful of times in field professionals. The expression of someone whose mental model of a situation has just been revised at a foundational level and who is doing the immediate cognitive work of rebuilding without falling apart. She looked the way I'd felt in my kitchen at 4 in the morning 9 years earlier, staring at the gray sky through my window. After the 10 minutes of silence, she said the thing about the trapper and the apology she owed him. And then she said one more thing that I haven't told you yet, because I've been working up to it. She said, "How long has this been happening for you?" I told her, 9 years, from the first spotlight incident. For separate incidents across that 9 years, the sound in the drainage, the child's voice, in addition to the first sighting. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." 2 years before the trapper, I had a call about tracks near a camp in my old district. I responded, I documented them, and I submitted them for wildlife analysis at the state level. The analysis came back inconclusive. The note from the wildlife biologist was one sentence. It said the tracks did not match any species known to be present in the region. That's it. One sentence. No follow-up. No request for additional documentation. Nothing. The file was closed. She looked at me when she finished saying that, and I understood what she was telling me, which was that the inconclusive analysis and the one-sentence note and the closed file were not the end of something. They were the shape of a policy. Someone at the state level had received a track analysis that didn't match any known species and had closed the file with a one-sentence notation and had done nothing. Which either meant they had no idea what they were looking at, or it meant they had a very good idea what they were looking at and had decided that the appropriate institutional response was a one-sentence notation and a closed file. I've thought about that a lot in the 11 years since Catherine told me. I don't know which explanation is correct. I don't know whether the people at the state level who've received inconclusive wildlife reports over the decades have been genuinely mystified or selectively incurious. I know that I've spent 19 years working a territory where these things happen, and I've watched the institutional response, in every case where a report made it above the district level, be exactly the same. Minimal documentation, no follow-up, no policy change, no acknowledgement. Either the institution genuinely doesn't know what it's dealing with, or it does and has decided that the correct response is silence. I'm not accusing anyone of a cover-up. That's not the right frame for it. The right frame, I think, is that institutions deal in categories, and what I'm describing doesn't fit any category the institution has developed language for, and things that don't fit categories get filed under whatever's nearest and set aside. It's not conspiracy, it's bureaucracy. The category the tracks went under was inconclusive, and the category the one-sentence note lived in was file closed, and nothing in the institutional structure created a path for the information to go anywhere from there. That's how knowledge gets lost, not because someone buries it, but because there's nowhere useful for it to go. I want to tell you about what happened in the years between the fourth incident and my transfer, because I've only given you the broad shape of those 8 years and the 3 additional incidents, and the broad shape doesn't carry the full weight of what those years were actually like. You work a territory long enough, you develop a relationship with it. Not a sentimental relationship, not the kind of nature appreciation that outdoor enthusiasts develop with places they love to visit. A working relationship, a functional, day-to-day knowledge of a specific piece of geography that becomes as automatic and unreflective as knowing your way around your own house. By my 12th year, my Northern Territory felt like an extension of my own spatial awareness. I knew where things were without consciously calculating it. I knew where incidents were likely to occur before they occurred, because I knew the terrain well enough to reason about what kinds of conditions produced what kinds of situations. That knowledge was one of the things that made me effective at the job, and I'm proud of it. What I'm about to tell you is that in the years after the fourth incident, that knowledge had a new layer added to it that I'd never had before and that I hadn't asked for. I developed an awareness of where in my territory the incidents clustered, and once I had that awareness I couldn't unhave it, the same way you can't unsee a pattern once you've seen it. It was geographic, as I've already said, certain drainages, certain road networks, certain elevation bands where the terrain had a specific character. But it was also temporal, which I hadn't fully recognized before. The incidents, and the smaller, more ambiguous encounters that I'd begun to notice and catalog in my own head, if not in my reports, were not evenly distributed across the year. They concentrated in the shoulder seasons, late October, late April into early May. Not exclusively. The child's voice incident was June. The circling in the timber was June as well. But concentrated, as though whatever was using that territory had an annual pattern to its presence, a rhythm that corresponded to something I couldn't identify. I mentioned this to one person, a retired biologist I met at a state wildlife conference in year 15 of my career, who spent his career studying large mammal movement patterns in the Northeast. I described the geographic and temporal clustering carefully and without naming what I believe the source of the pattern to be, framing it as an unusual pattern of wildlife activity I'd observed over many years in a specific territory. He listened carefully and asked several specific questions about elevation, vegetation type, proximity to water sources, and seasonal timing. When I'd answered all of them, he was quiet for a moment and then said something that I've thought about more than almost anything else from 19 years of this work. He said, "That's a winter range to summer range transition pattern. Whatever's producing that, it's moving seasonally. It has a home range, and your territory is likely in the transitional zone between the winter and summer portions of it. The shoulder season concentration you're seeing is the movement through. He said it as a purely observational comment, the way a scientist describes a pattern without necessarily committing to a cause. He didn't ask what kind of animal I was describing. I didn't volunteer it. We moved on to other topics, but what he'd said had the quality of something that made too much sense and that I wished I hadn't heard, because once a pattern has an explanation, even a partial, speculative one, it's no longer just a pattern. It becomes evidence, and evidence requires you to draw conclusions, and the conclusion this evidence pointed toward was one I wasn't ready to fully commit to in year 15, even after everything I'd already experienced. Whatever I've been encountering in 19 years in that territory is not randomly distributed across the landscape. It is not a single animal in a fixed territory. It moves seasonally. It has a home range large enough to take it through my territory twice a year, in each direction, on a schedule consistent enough to produce statistically visible clustering in my 15-year internal log. And it has been doing this, based on the accounts I've collected from retired colleagues and old-timers in the communities adjacent to that territory, for as long as anyone in that system can remember, which in several cases means accounts going back 50 or 60 years. Back to when the timber industry was at its peak in northern Maine, and those drainages were full of logging crews rather than the sparse recreational and enforcement traffic they see today. 50 or 60 years of accounts, in the same territory, following a pattern consistent with seasonal movement of a large mammal population. The biologist I spoke to said it was a winter range to summer range transition. He was describing the behavior of something he assumed was a known species in an unusual pattern. What I believe he was actually describing, without knowing it, was the regular, seasonal, routine movement of animals that nobody in any official capacity has been willing to put a name to in my territory in 50 or 60 years of documented encounters. I said earlier that I don't use the names people use for these things, and I'm going to hold to that here. Not because I think the names are wrong, necessarily, but because they come loaded with cultural baggage that distorts how people hear accounts like this one. The moment you use a specific name, the account shifts from being a careful, factual report from a trained professional about something he experienced and observed, into being a story in a genre that most people have already decided how to classify. I want you to have my account without that distortion. Call it what you want after you've heard it. My job was to observe and report accurately, and that's what I'm doing here. What I reported to my supervisor at the end of my 18th year, when I filed my transfer request, was a professional decision about career development and quality of life. What I'm reporting to you now, 18 months after that transfer and with some distance from the Northern Territory for the first time in my career, is everything I couldn't put in an official report, but that was always the true reason for the decision. I am not afraid of the dark. I am not afraid of wilderness. I am not afraid of large animals, including the genuinely dangerous ones. I have spent 19 years going into places alone that most people would find deeply frightening, at hours that most people will never experience, and I've done it competently and professionally, and without, for the most part, unnecessary fear. Fear is a tool in my profession. It tells you when the risk calculus has shifted and requires recalibration. It is not a response to be ashamed of. When fear tells me something, I listen to it. What I decided in my 18th year was that continuing to work that territory was producing a specific kind of sustained, low-grade fear that was not serving the job and was not serving me. Not fear of any specific encounter, not fear of any specific animal or location. A different thing, harder to name. The fear of having spent 18 years in close proximity to something I couldn't understand, knowing more about it with every year that passed, and realizing that more knowledge was not moving me toward resolution. It was moving me deeper into a territory that had no exit in the direction I was traveling. There was no point at which I was going to understand this enough to do anything with the understanding. There was only the continued accumulation of data about something that had been in those woods for longer than any of the institutions I worked for had existed, that would be there long after I retired, and that had not and would not change its behavior based on anything I did or said or reported. You can do a job in those conditions. Plenty of people do. I did it for 18 years. But you can also make a decision, when you have the career longevity and the professional standing to make it cleanly, that you've given enough of yourself to one piece of understanding and it's time to work somewhere with different light, different roads, different trees, different hours. I made that decision. I drove that Northern Territory one more time before my transfer, a final circuit of the major roads in my district, in daylight, in early April when the snowmelt was running in every ditch and the woods had the gray, stripped quality they have before the leaves come back. It took me most of a day. I drove every major road I'd patrolled for 18 years, and I took the logging grade through the mile marker 9 section, and I drove past the junction where the camp road branched off, and I drove through the part of the district where the tracks around the hunting camp had been, and I drove past the drainage where my truck had broken down that June afternoon all those years ago. Nothing happened. Nothing unusual happened. The woods were the woods. The road was the road. The daylight was flat and gray and completely ordinary. I could have been any person driving through that country for any reason, and the country gave nothing back to mark the 18 years I'd worked in it. I drove back to my district office, signed out my last patrol, and went home. Whatever is in those drainages is still there. This I know with the same certainty I know anything. It was there before me, and it'll be there when whoever replaces me in that district has their own 19 years of encounters and carries their own years of unofficial knowledge. It is patient in a way that outlasts individual careers, individual lifetimes. Whatever it is, it has been in northern Maine for longer than the state has existed, and it will be there after the last logging road grows over, and the last camp collapses, and the last warden drives the last patrol circuit through those trees. I sleep better now. Different territory, different roads, closer to town, more lights on the horizon. I don't miss the Northern Territory the way I thought I might. I thought I would, because I loved it for a long time, loved the specific solitude and the quality of the dark up there, and the way the stars looked in winter with no light pollution for 30 miles in any direction. I don't miss it. What I feel when I think about it, which is less often than I used to, is not nostalgia. It's something more like the feeling you have when you've been in a place that held something large and old and patient, and you've come back to somewhere smaller and more manageable, and you can feel the difference in the air, the specific lightness of being in a place where the weight of that presence is not there. I'm not going to tell you those woods are dangerous. They weren't dangerous to me in 18 years. Not once, in all of it, was I in danger. The thing at the road's edge stepped back. Whatever circled my truck in the timber left when the tow truck arrived. The child's voice stopped and did not pursue me when I went back to the truck. The thing at mile marker 9 stepped to the side of the road and moved into the trees without any movement toward my vehicle or toward Catherine or me. Whatever it wanted from those interactions, it wasn't violence. It was observation. Assessment. Some purpose I couldn't understand and wasn't able to extract from all the years of data I accumulated. But I want to be honest with you about something. I think the child's voice was trying to get me further into those trees. I think if I had been less trained, or less experienced, or less methodical, the voice would have drawn me deeper than 40 yards before it stopped, and I would have been further from my truck and my radio and the road, in dense timber, in the dark, alone, with something that had demonstrated that it understood specifically how to use a human being's own instincts against them. I don't know what would have happened if I'd gotten further in. I don't know if that matters. What I know is that after 20 minutes of searching, I went back to my truck, and that decision, to turn around and go back rather than press on deeper, is one I'm grateful for in a way that goes beyond anything I can put into professional language. That is the account of 19 years in northern Maine. That is what I've seen. That is what I know, at the end of it, that I didn't know at the beginning. I've been a careful professional in a difficult and important job, and I've tried to report what I've experienced as honestly and precisely as I'm capable of reporting anything. The details are accurate. The conclusions I've drawn from those details are my own, and you're free to draw different ones. But I'd ask you to sit with one thing before you do. Whatever is in those drainages in the northern part of this state, it has been there for at least 50 or 60 years of documented accounts, probably much longer. It moves seasonally. It travels through terrain that covers hundreds of miles. It understands how human beings respond to specific stimuli. It knows what sounds will draw a person out of a vehicle. It watches from the edges of clearings and road verges, and it watches without being seen, in terrain so dense and so remote that the most thorough wildlife census in the state's history hasn't produced a definitive record of its existence. It is not a ghost story. It is not folklore. It is an animal, or it is something else, and it is real, and it is large, and it has been in those woods for longer than any of us, and it is going to be in those woods long after the last person who ever saw it is gone. Sleep well. I keep coming back to the tracks at the hunting camp, the ones in my 18th year that made my transfer decision feel final. I want to describe them more carefully than I have, because the tracks were the clearest physical evidence I collected in 19 years, and clear evidence is rare in this work, and it deserves more precision than I've given it. The camp was a modest structure, a four-season cabin built in the 70s, set back from the road in a clearing with a small brook behind it. The clearing was roughly half an acre, grass and some low alder scrub at the edges, with good sight lines from the cabin windows in most directions. The hunters who'd reported the disturbance were a group of 4, all experienced, all from the same family that had owned this camp for 30-some years. They were not people who startled easily or who reported wildlife incidents casually. The patriarch of the group, a man in his late 70s who'd been hunting that camp since before I was born, was the one who met me at the road and walked me in. He didn't say much on the walk to the camp. He walked with a deliberateness that told me he'd processed whatever he'd seen and arrived at a decision about how to present it, and that decision was, show the warden the evidence and let the evidence speak. I respected that. We walked to the back of the cabin, to the brook, and he stopped and pointed. The impressions were in a stretch of soft ground between the brook's edge and the cabin wall, roughly 20 feet of terrain that the moisture from the brook kept soft enough to record detailed impressions even in dry conditions. There were 9 individual impressions clearly visible, and the pattern they made around the cabin, because when I checked the perimeter, the pattern continued in both directions, was unmistakable. Something had walked around that cabin, staying close, within 12 to 15 feet of the walls, all the way around. Not a circuit of the camp clearing, the structure itself. A circuit of the building. I measured the impressions, 14 to 15 inches in length, 6 to 6.5 inches in width, stride length approximately 4 feet, which on terrain that flat and soft indicated a relaxed walking pace rather than a running or climbing gait. Depth in the soft ground, with my reference boot generating a half-inch depression, was close to 1.5 inches, suggesting weight considerably greater than my own. The toe pattern, where it was preserved, showed 5 toes, with the large toe significantly wider and the spacing different from the human pattern I'd spent years documenting and tracking training. The old man stood next to me while I measured and photographed, and said very little. Once, while I was crouching to examine a particularly clear impression, he said, "That's not a bear." He said it in a flat, declarative tone, not asking for confirmation, just stating the obvious, so it was stated. I agreed with him, also flatly, and we left it there. Before I left the camp, he stopped me at the edge of the clearing and said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "My grandfather hunted this country. He had a name for what makes those tracks. A name from the people who were here before us. I don't know if that name is the right name. But it's older than anything either of us will ever figure out." He said it without drama, without any apparent desire for me to comment on it, and then walked back toward the cabin and didn't look back. I drove out of that camp and I understood something that I'd been slowly assembling for years but hadn't quite articulated to myself before that moment. Whatever I'd been encountering in northern Maine was not new. It was not a mystery that had appeared in my career and would be resolved in someone else's career. It was old. Old in a way that made the 50 or 60 years of accounts I'd collected look like a very recent footnote. The name the old man's grandfather had for it was older than the families who'd built camps in this territory, older than the loggers who'd cut the roads, older than the state of Maine, older than any institution that has ever tried to categorize and manage the wildlife of this region. Whatever is in those woods was named long before I was born by people who lived alongside it for generations, and the name didn't come from folklore or campfire stories. It came from direct, sustained, long-term observation of something real. I don't know that name. The old man didn't tell me, and I didn't ask, because asking in that moment would have been the wrong kind of question in the wrong register. What I took from that conversation is what I needed to take, that the thing I'd been encountering for 18 years in the remote drainages of my district was not something that appeared in the historical record of that territory only when wardens and biologists and modern land managers showed up to look for it. It was there in the record of every group of people who have ever spent significant time in that country, because significant time in that country, properly attended to, produces the encounters I've described. Always has. Probably always will. There's one more thing I want to tell you. This is the thing I've debated including the most, because it's the hardest to describe in a way that doesn't sound like something it isn't. In my 16th year, on a night in late November when I was doing a late circuit of the northern roads in early hunting season darkness, I came to a section of the Maine logging grade where the road crosses a small stream on a culvert bridge, a low structure in a section where the timber closes in on both sides and the road dips into a hollow. I'd crossed that culvert bridge hundreds of times. I knew it as well as anything in my territory. As I came over the rise before the bridge, my headlights swept the road ahead, and for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be certain, too short for the conscious analysis that produces certainty, I saw something standing at the far side of the bridge. Standing in the road, looking back at me down the bridge. By the time my lights were fully on the bridge, it was empty. The fraction of a second between the lights sweeping across the road and my headlights fully illuminating the bridge is real, and I can't expand it or change it. What I saw in that fraction of a second registered as large, upright, and looking at me, and then it was gone. I drove over the bridge, stopped, got out, checked. Nothing. No sound. No tracks on the soft road verge at the bridge's end. I drove on and said nothing. What I want to tell you about that, and the reason I've been debating whether to include it, is what I felt in that fraction of a second. Not during the search, not in the aftermath. In the moment itself, in the fraction of a second before my headlights fully resolved the empty road, and my conscious mind caught up to what my nervous system was already doing, which was running every alarm it had. What I felt was recognized, not observed, not targeted, not threatened. Recognized. The specific, particular feeling of being seen by something that knows who you are, has known you for some time, and is noting your presence the way you'd note the presence of a person you've worked alongside for years. Not a warm recognition, not a human recognition. Something more like the recognition between two creatures who have been in the same territory for long enough to have established mutual awareness. I don't know how to explain that. I don't know if it was real or if it was my mind projecting something onto a fraction of a second of ambiguous visual input after 16 years of building a very specific psychological relationship with a very specific piece of territory and the things in it. I include it because it happened, and I'm trying to give you an honest account. What I do know is that it was not the first time I had felt that particular quality of recognition. It was the most concentrated instance, the clearest, the most undeniable. But in smaller, more diffuse forms, it had been present in the territory for years. A quality in certain stretches of certain roads at certain hours, a quality in the specific timber around certain camps and certain drainages, something that the word watched only partially captures and that a more honest description would call mutual awareness. I was aware of the territory. The territory was aware of me. And whatever was in it that I'd been encountering for 18 years had been aware of me long enough that by year 16, when I caught that half-second glimpse at the culvert bridge, what I felt was not the shock of a first encounter. It was the complicated, vertiginous feeling of a long-running relationship finally breaking the surface of ordinary daily work into something I had to consciously register, even for a fraction of a second, before the lights resolved and the road was empty and the ordinary world reassembled around me the way it always did, with everything that lived outside of it pushed back to wherever it went when the headlights came on. I transferred out of northern Maine 18 months ago. I work a coastal district now. Different territory, different rhythm, different light. I am good at this job, and I will continue to do it well. What I carry from 19 years of northern patrol, I carry quietly, the way you carry things that don't have a comfortable home in any conversation you're likely to have in an ordinary professional life. It is not a burden, exactly. It is more like the particular weight of having spent 18 years in a room that turned out to be larger than its walls suggested, and having spent those years learning the shape of that extra space, and having come out the other side with a picture of the world that doesn't quite match the picture most people carry. The woods are not empty. I know this with a certainty I'd put against any other certainty I hold, from 19 years of careful, professional, evidence-based observation in some of the most remote terrain in the eastern United States. Whatever is in the deep northern timber of this state, it is there. It has always been there, and if you spend enough nights alone in the places where it lives, moving at the right hours on the right roads through the right terrain, it will know you are there too. It already does. That's all I have. That's my 18 years. Take it for whatever it's worth to you. I want to leave you with one practical thing, because I've spent this whole account describing experiences, and I don't want to leave you only with that. If you hunt or fish or hike or work in remote terrain in northern Maine, in the unorganized territories, in the drainages north of Greenville, in the long timber north of Millinocket and north of Jackman, I want you to know a few things from someone who spent 18 years working those roads. The territory is not going to hurt you. In 18 years, and in every account I collected from colleagues and from the public and from old-timers who'd worked that country for decades before me, no one was physically harmed. The encounters are alarming. The sounds, when you hear them, are alarming. The tracks, when you find them, are alarming. The visual sightings, when they happen, are alarming. None of it, to the best of my knowledge, has ever resulted in injury to a person. Whatever is in those woods, it has coexisted with human activity in that territory for as long as there has been human activity in that territory, and it has done so without violence. What I would tell you, from 18 years of direct experience, is this. Stay with your vehicle on remote roads at night if you can. Not because you're in danger if you get out, but because there is a difference between you in your vehicle, which is a known and categorized thing in that territory, and you on foot in remote timber in the dark, which is something different. The child's voice is the only time I have ever felt that a specific mechanism was being used to remove me from my vehicle, and I believe it was. I got out and went into the trees. Nothing bad happened. But I came within 20 minutes of getting further in, and I have never stopped being glad that I turned around. Pay attention to the wildlife around you. Marmots going underground on a clear day with no aerial predator. Birds going quiet in a section of timber that was active a few minutes before. A deer moving away from a direction other than the direction you came from. The animals in those woods have a longer and more continuous history of living alongside whatever shares their territory than any human institution does. They've calibrated their responses over generations. When the response is fire for no reason you can see, pay attention to that. The reason may be one you don't have the sensory equipment to detect yet. And if you work in that country professionally, if you're a logger, a guide, a trapper, a wildlife biologist, a game warden, anyone whose job puts you out there alone in the remote north in all seasons at all hours, know that whatever you encounter that doesn't fit your categories is not a failure of your observation or your training. It is a feature of the territory. You are not the first person who has encountered it. You are not the last. The accounts exist, even if they exist in the personal logs of individual wardens rather than in any official database. The pattern exists, even if no institution has been willing to name it. You are not crazy, and you are not alone in what you've seen. That's what I needed to say. 18 years in the North, and that's what I needed to say.